B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Wednesday, November 20th, 2019. I'm happy to report that Marin County appears to have been spared from the planned intentional power shutdown due to high winds and extreme fire conditions here in Northern California. So I do expect to be able to bring you a podcast tomorrow. But if you don't hear from me, it means they changed their minds and left us in the dark once again. So today, I think, was a breakthrough day for the Democratic-driven impeachment inquiry hearings on Capitol Hill. And once again, Gordon Sondland, the guy who bought the ambassadorship to the EU for about $1 million and who was carrying water for Trump routinely. Well, he sang a new song. He refreshed his memory and revised and extended his remarks. And while he didn't actually sing, had he, the song would have been called Quid Pro Quo C. C meaning yes. And for those of us old enough, or so old that we remember vividly, the sequence of events in Watergate that led to the attempted impeachment of Richard Nixon and his resignation, the key figures were John Dean, the White House counsel who flipped on Nixon and shared his advice to the president that there was a cancer on his presidency, and White House staffers, little-known people named Alexander Butterfield and Eagle Krogh, who revealed the White House taping system. Well, today, Sondland acknowledged that there was a quid pro quo. He expanded the cast of rogues to include Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, Mick Mulvaney, and, of course, America's mayor, Rudolph Giuliani. They're all part of what appears to be a racketeering scheme. They are conspirators in a series of events aimed at delivering for Donald Trump, under his direction, a pressure campaign that would force the new and inexperienced president of Ukraine to bend to the will of our stable genius president. And one of the key things that Sondland pointed out is that Trump only wanted the announcement of investigations. He didn't appear to care if they actually carried them out. And so Sondland's testimony, I think, is very significant. And under normal circumstances, we would be saying, hey, you know, this is the tipping point. Trump cannot possibly survive this. But then we look at the Republican lock on the United States Senate and the lock on that Republican majority. Loyalty to Trump, political expediency and opportunism is the highest calling they know. And so we can't get too giddy about this. I know a lot of people so desperate to see Trump exit. Every time there is negative testimony in this impeachment inquiry, they say, oh, that's it. He's gone. But he's not going to be gone unless we see a significant shift among Republicans. And I want to point out I'm not a big fan of Adam Schiff, the chair of the Intelligence Committee who's presiding over these hearings. I think he's doing a decent job there. But yesterday, as he wound up the second session, and it was 8:30 in the evening Washington time, he actually raised his voice. He showed some animation. And he said that the reason this is an issue is that Trump got caught. And that Republicans are stuck with that, even as they try to explain away, distract us, raise a lot of false points so that they claim relate to due process. And Devin Nunes, you know, there's no Enya over the second N in his name. It's Nunes, not Nunez. the Republican from Fresno, just exposes himself as a Trump toady and an idiot every day. He recites these same talking points about how the Republicans have been locked out, they can't call their own witnesses, and, this is part of the witch hunt of Russiagate. And Jim Jordan is the guy they, at the last minute, stashed on the committee because he's the kind of attack dog that Devin Nunes isn't. So at this point, we have Trump trying to selectively to cherry pick the lengthy opening statement and the response to questions that Gordon Sondland gave today. And he focuses in on one thing that is a brief phone call that Sondland had with Trump in mid-September, after Trump already knew that he was, that his actions were going to be exposed. And that's when Trump said, I don't want anything from him, referring to Zelensky. I want nothing. No quid pro quo. And I guess for some people, Trump can isolate that from all of this and just say, see? And that's what he tried to do as he was heading for a helicopter today. He said that Sondland had testified the president had told him that he wanted nothing from Ukraine. There was no quid pro quo. That means it's all over, Trump said. This is the final word from the president of the United States. I want nothing. Well, he can pretend. But the Democrats have assembled a very damaging record here of testimony. I also find it interesting as I watched the hearings this morning. The Republicans keep asking about the drug deal. They never cite who mentioned the drug deal the first time. And by the way, there's no indication that drugs are involved here. That was a metaphor that John Bolton used, allegedly after the July 10th meeting where Sondland brazenly told the Ukrainians that they had to quid pro quo or they wouldn't get a White House meeting. Sondland maintains he didn't know about the withholding of the military aid at that point. And so we heard the Republican counsel asking Sondland about a drug deal. And the Republicans seem oblivious to the fact that this is coming from John Bolton. Bolton characterized the shenanigans of Rudy Giuliani and, Igor, and what's that other guy's name? Len, as a drug deal. And he told people like Vindman, to tell it to the lawyers. So I think that's Project A for the Democrats over the Thanksgiving break. They need to figure out how to fast-track the court order that Bolton says he needs in order to show up and testify. I think Bolton could persuade he could persuade some Republican senators. I don't know if it could deliver the margin, but we first need to crack their unity, and then something could happen. So Sondland is a very interesting witness, and it was interesting to see as Nunes trotted through the Chalupa allegations and Burisma that the Republicans are desperately trying to separate the coded language that when investigations in Ukraine were demanded, when Burisma was mentioned, Burisma equals the Bidens. But the Republicans try to claim that Trump had this overarching opposition to corruption, and he's so, stingy with foreign aid that he didn't want it going to a corrupt government. He only used corruption as a cover for his efforts to drive a political investigation in Ukraine. And so I think this is a pivotal moment. There's some minor contradictions We've got this guy, his name is Holmes, David Holmes, a political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine. He went to lunch with Sondland when Sondland called Trump. And Holmes says he overheard the name Biden mentioned by Trump. And Sondland denies that. But that's a pretty minor quibble, in my opinion. He also says that he didn't recall the July 10th meeting ending abruptly with Bolton angry, as Fiona Hill has testified. Quote, their recollections of those events simply don't square with my own or those of Ambassador Volker or Secretary Perry. I recall mentioning the prerequisite of investigations before any White House call or meeting, but I do not recall any yelling or screaming or abrupt terminations, as others have said. Again, John Bolton could clear that up. Will he? And it's interesting, too, because as the Republicans claim that they can't call their own witnesses, many of the witnesses who are key, like John Bolton, are being told by the White House that they can't testify. But, of course, the president's Twitter followers don't either understand that or want to. So, some key takeaways from Sondland? Well, number one, my impression is that he made it clear that he's not going down alone. That if he ends up in the dock, in court, or ending up in prison, that he wants company. Mike, Mick, Mike, and Rudy. And if you can't follow all those, there are two Mikes, Pompeo and Pence. Mick is Mulvaney, the permanent acting White House chief of staff, and everybody knows by the smell who Rudy is. Anyway, Sondland flatly said, we followed the president's orders. The committee that Trump directed the Ukraine pressure campaign that Mike Pompeo signed off. Mike Pence was told about the link between Ukraine's military aid and the investigations. He confirmed there was a clear quid pro quo for the White House meeting that Trump had offered in his first phone call to Zelensky in April. Now, one of the things that I can continue to kind of quibble over is we hear the Republicans say, and in general the Democrats will acknowledge, that Ukraine didn't announce any new investigations. But I vividly recall, and I covered it on the podcast in mid to late September, I lamented that Zelensky was caving. He put his new justice minister out to say that there were going to be audits of past investigations and that Burisma was on the list. So, that's my clear recollection here, and that's only, 6 or 8 weeks ago. Anyway, here's an exchange between Dan Goldman, the Democratic lawyer, and Sondland. Now, for Mr. Giuliani, by this point, you understand that in order to get that White House meeting, that Ukraine would have to initiate these two investigations. Is that right? Well, Sondland said they would have to announce they were going to do it. Right, because Giuliani and Trump didn't actually care if they did them, right? I never heard, Mr. Goldman, anyone say that the investigations had to start or had to be completed. The only thing I heard from Giuliani or otherwise was that they had to be announced in some form, and that form kept changing. And you'll recall that at one point that Kurt Volker, the special envoy to Ukraine, and Sondland had composed a statement that they wanted Zelensky to read. But the Republicans say, well, Zelensky never read it. So no harm, no foul, no crime. What are we here for? And the other key and most damaging part of the Sondland testimony under oath today, everyone was in the loop. It was no secret. Everyone was informed via email on July 19th, days before the presidential call. So this is going to be a very interesting period of time as we see a lot of squirming rats. And with Trump claiming that he barely knows Sondland, just like he barely knows Mike Cohen today, just like he barely knows Paul Manafort. You know how it is. If you get in trouble, Trump immediately forgets about you. Now, here's a curious item that popped up in the coverage today. The FBI is seeking an interview with the whistleblower. The Washington field office has contacted one of the whistleblower's attorneys. The FBI and legal team have traded messages. We're told the FBI is interested in the substance of the whistleblower's complaint. I don't know why the FBI needs to get involved here. Maybe to follow up on charges against Mike, Mick, and Rudy. That part might make sense, but I'd still like to hear a little more detail about the context of that initiative. So one of the other things that has surfaced is the relationship between Giuliani, who is described as the president's attorney, even though he said he wasn't doing legal work for Trump in Ukraine. Well, here's a quote from Sondland. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for Zelensky. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine make a public statement announcing investigations of the 2016 election, the DNC server, and Burisma. Sondland continued, I was opposed to any suspension of aid as the Ukrainians needed those funds to fight Russian aggression. I tried diligently to ask why the aid was suspended, but I never received a clear answer still to this day. In the absence of any credible explanation for the suspension, I later came to believe that the resumption of security aid would not occur until there was a public statement from Ukraine committing to the investigations of the 2016 election and Burisma as Giuliani had demanded. So this testimony squarely puts Rudy Giuliani at the center of this circle. I know that's mangled language, but I'm committed to it now. Also, I find it weird that Sondland would continue to say that he's proud to be one of the three amigos with Volker and with Energy Secretary Rick Perry and his Superman glasses. We didn't want to work with Giuliani. Simply put, we were playing the hand we were dealt. We all understood if we refused to work with him, we would lose a very important opportunity to cement relations between the U.S. and Ukraine. So we followed the president's orders. And in the language of Trump and his circle, one of the critical things that was teased out, that Sondland said he never heard Trump explicitly link the investigations to the lifting of the hold on the military aid. Quote, Trump never told me directly that the aid was contingent on the meetings. The only thing we got directly from Giuliani was that the Burisma and 2016 investigations were contingent on the White House meeting. The aid was my own personal, guess based on your analogy, 2 + 2 = 4. By September 8th, I was absolutely convinced of what he calls the quid pro quo. Over at the New York Times, a good piece by Peter Baker today. He's an analyst, and he points out that it's for the White House to be attacking people who still work there. Now, Trump vilified Jeff Sessions when he was still the Attorney General, but that was kind of an exception. But starting with Alexander Vindman, starting with Ambassador Yovanovitch last Friday, then Vindman, and Trump trash-tweeted Jennifer Williams, who still works for Mike Pence. And what Baker notes here is that Trump has publicly disparaged cabinet secretaries, former aides, and career officials working elsewhere in the government, but now he is taking aim at people still working for him inside the White House. It reflects the president's long-standing distrust of the career professionals who populate the White House. Later, Baker says, all three witnesses who testified publicly last week still work for the State Department, and Trump directly denigrated one of them, Yovanovitch. But Vindman and Williams were the first to appear before the House Intelligence Committee while still working in the White House. And it's interesting because Trump shifted from using his personal Twitter account to the White House Twitter account to attack the witnesses. And I'm not sure what the reason for that is. My understanding is the White House account has far fewer followers than Trump's real Donald J. Trump account. So I don't really know the rationale there. One of his tweets about Williams over the weekend, tell Jennifer Williams, whoever that is, he loves this, that I don't know these people, so they don't exist, to read both transcripts of the presidential calls and see the just-released statement from Ukraine. Then she should meet with the other never-Trumpers who I don't know and mostly never even heard of, work out a better presidential attack. This guy is such a self-styled victim. I mean, for him to feel intimidated by an advisor to Mike Pence just shows how insecure he is. Williams, asked about the president's tweet, said, it certainly surprised me. I wasn't expecting to be called out by name. Meanwhile, Mike Pompeo, freshly named, he's in Brussels meeting with NATO leaders, and that's got to be a sticky meeting because with Turkey going rogue, they didn't notify the other NATO members about the deal with Trump regarding northeast Syria. They also are uncomfortable with Turkey's alliance with Russia, buying some anti-missile defense stuff from Russia while still trying to buy the F-35 fighter jet from the U.S. So it's got to be messy. And we have French President Macron saying that we are currently experiencing the brain death of NATO. Now, I'm not a big fan of NATO, and I think it needs a top-to-bottom review. They need to define their mission in the 21st century, and they haven't done so. It is really just an appendage of the United States, which we use at our convenience. We know Mike Pompeo is not going to take that up today. Every day I like to pause for a second and thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast. Hit the P.O. Box yesterday, and I want to thank Frank Shinneman from right here in Marin County for taking out a new annual subscription. And also Andy Droll, a longtime listener and supporter. He goes back to the syndicated radio show in 2008 or 2009. I recall talking to him when he lived on the East Coast. He's now out here in Silicon Valley. And he catches up with my podcast. So based on the note that he sent on November 11th with a comment about a May 23rd podcast, I'm expecting that Andy will hear of my gratitude sometime in April. And that's fine. You can listen to these podcasts whenever you want, even in the middle of the night, even 6 months later. It doesn't matter to me. I think they're better, fresher. But in any event, I want you to emulate Frank and Andy and support me with a subscription. Visit peterbcollins.com, click on menu, click on Become a Subscriber. You hit the sign-up page, and in seconds you can choose the level of support that's comfortable for you. And if you're allergic to PayPal, yo comprendo, you can address your correspondence to my P.O. Box number 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Now, we are all pretty absorbed, at least I am, by this impeachment drama that's underway. And tonight, there's a Democratic debate, the monthly presidential candidate forum, coming from Georgia, from Atlanta. But while we are distracted by all this, Thomas Massie, who is a Republican congressman from Kentucky, and he earns special credit because he votes with the Republican Party most of the time. But on civil liberties issues, he is a standout. And together with the now independent congressman from Michigan, Justin Amash, he stands for our Fourth Amendment rights. And yesterday he tweeted, while everyone is distracted by impeachment, Congress will extend warrantless data collection provisions of the Patriot Act by hiding this language on page 25 of the continuing resolution that temporarily funds the government. To sneak this through, Democrats are suspending the 72-hour rule, meaning that you can't vote on legislation until 72 hours after it's been introduced to give members an opportunity to actually read this stuff. So there you go, our friendly Democrats who want to get Trump out of office are nevertheless going to give him the continuing power to use unconstitutional surveillance on Americans. Now, I'm often critical of the international coverage of The Guardian based in Britain, but they often show up the American media, and today they've done it again. In their pre-coverage of the Democratic presidential debate, They write a topic that will be missing at the debate: who will be able to vote? And they are focused on voter suppression schemes like the one that denied Stacey Abrams the governorship in Georgia last year. And so I commend The Guardian for raising the issue, and let's all watch and see and hope that Democrats will pick up that voter suppression is one of the reasons that Trump won the Electoral College and was installed as president. And now, as a further form of retaliation, the very people who stole the election from Stacey Abrams are investigating, demanding more and more information from two nonprofits that she set up to expand voter participation in Georgia. The Republican-led State Ethics Commission filed a lawsuit against her back in April, and they are continuing to demand more information from her campaign. I'll reduce it to one word: disgusting. Tonight on the debate stage, the main target will be Pete Buttigieg, who is now polling at the top of the field in Iowa. And his support is sketchy across the country, particularly among African Americans. In fact, he is currently polling in South Carolina with less than 1% support from black voters. And he's had a rough overall experience with his black voters in South Bend, Indiana. And at a fundraiser in Palm Springs last week, he questioned why African Americans are so willing to support Joe Biden. And he said that it's familiarity, that they have a kind of familiarity with Biden. I think it's an open question, and I would ask African Americans to reconsider their kind of mindless support of Joe Biden. He's not good for any of us, in my opinion. Over at Jacobin Mag, Luke Savage has written a piece headlined, "The Corporate Media's War Against Bernie Sanders is Very Real," and he provides data. They did an analysis of the primetime shows, all right? Brian Williams, Chris Hayes, Ari Melber, Chris Matthews, Lawrence O'Donnell, and Rachel Maddow. In August and September, MSNBC talked about Biden twice as often as Warren, 3 times as often as Sanders. On 64% of 240 episodes discussing Biden, 43% discussed Warren, and 36% mentioned Sanders. A quarter of the episodes only discussed Biden, 5% and 1% only mentioned Warren or Sanders, respectively. Of all the 3 candidates at the top, Sanders was least likely to be mentioned positively, only 13% of his mentions, and most likely to be mentioned negatively, 20%, 21%. The remaining 2/3 of his mentions were neutral. Warren had the lowest proportion of negative coverage at 7.9% and the highest proportion of positive mentions at 31%. And one more bite here. In a later episode, Chris Matthews and the Roots Johnson, I don't know her name, claimed African-American women were leaving Bernie and breaking for Warren, even though a Pew Research poll that was presented that week showed Sanders' base to be the least white of the leading 4 candidates. So there's no question that Bernie is getting the shaft from the corporate media again this year. And I want to commend Politico for publishing a revealing article today about the 1630 Fund, a little-known nonprofit dark money Democratic organization based in Washington. They spent $141 million in 2018. They received massive donations. The single largest donation was almost $52 million. And they don't have to disclose their donors, so we don't know if that came from a labor union, for example, or from a wealthy individual. And they quote Robert McGuire over at CREW, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. These kinds of totals aren't unheard of. I do think they're unheard of on the liberal side. In terms of the size of dark money networks, there are only a few that have gone in the 100 million plus range, and the Koch brothers are the first who come to mind. There's more information here. Follow the link in the show file at peterbcollins.com. Jeff Merkley, the liberal senator from Oregon, he got a hold of a memo from the immigration folks from December of 2017, and he tweeted about it. I released a document showing that the Trump administration planned to traumatize children and intentionally create a humanitarian crisis at the border. And these documents show that they knew that separating children from parents, increasing prosecutions of the parents, and punishing the children would occur, and they wanted it because they thought it would have a deterrent effect. Over in Israel, the deadlock continues. Benny Gantz, who is just this much better than Benjamin Netanyahu, is unable to form a government, and now under the arcane Israeli system, the charge of forming a government goes to the Knesset, the parliament. They have 21 days to come up with a candidate, anybody, who could command a majority of 61 seats in the 120-seat House. And what's really ugly here is that Benny Gantz, in some ways, stood on principle. He refused to form a unity government if it included Netanyahu. But he joined Netanyahu in racist denunciations of the Arab politicians who were elected by Arab Israelis. They have 6 or 7 seats, I think, in the current Knesset. And we have commentary from Benny Gantz that he didn't want to become part of what Avigdor Lieberman described as an anti-Zionist fifth column. And the Arab electeds have also been demonized by Netanyahu in similar racist terms. I don't know what is driving the unrest in South America, but the latest country to respond to protests is Colombia. They've announced plans to close their borders, to impose curfews and bans on the sale of alcohol, as troops have taken to the streets. Chile has seen more than a month of anti-government protests, and of course, the U.S.-backed coup in Bolivia has left protesters there in the streets almost daily. I want to commend my buddy Andy Worthington, the British journalist who continues his focus on America's gulag at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. I invite you to read his latest piece, Trump's Personal Prisoners at Guantanamo. He profiles 5 men who have been authorized, cleared for release from Gitmo because they were innocent. They were not terrorists. And he refers to them as Trump's personal prisoners. He says the most well-known of the 3 is Abdul Latif Nasir, a Moroccan whose release was recommended by a review board in 2016 before Obama left, but Obama didn't release him, and it appears Trump will never lift a finger to release him. And this guy had plans to go home and get married and, live. But no. Here in California, Governor Newsom is moving on fracking and other gruesome forms of oil extraction. He announced a moratorium on new permits for fracking until they can be reviewed by an independent panel of scientists. He also imposed a moratorium on new permits for what's called steam-injected oil drilling. And in that process, they pump superheated steam into wells to push up the oil. And I give Newsom credit. He signed a law which revises the mission of the agency that regulates the oil industry here. It's called DOGGR for some reason. And he has added public safety and environmental quality to the rubrics, if you will, the metrics for regulating the industry. And on Tuesday, he halted all pending fracking permits. He said these are necessary steps to strengthen oversight of oil and gas extraction as we phase out our dependence on fossil fuels and focus on clean energy. This transition can't happen overnight. It must advance in a deliberate way to protect people, our environment, and the economy. And finally today, did you hear about this? Trump's got his wall at the southern border. It's going to keep out people and drugs, he says. But resourceful people on the other side of the border have already cut some holes in the new slats, that kind of fencing that Trump apparently personally selected. And now we have a 16-year-old boy, an American who lives in San Diego, caught because he was using a remote control car, this little miniature car, and it was able to fit with a large bag, a duffel bag of methamphetamine, and squeeze through this hole in the border wall. So the boy was trying to pick up his latest shipment, and the Border Patrol found him lurking. They picked him up with 50 packages of meth, a 55-pound haul estimated with a street value of $100,000. And it just shows that nothing will stop people who are determined to move people or goods across our border. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You can share it with anyone. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.